On today's show, we have Chris Ryan. Chris Ryan's work has been translated into over 20 languages and appeared just about everywhere, including Netflix, HBO, MSNBC, and much more. Chris has been a featured speaker at TED, South by Southwest, a frequent guest on the Joe Rogan Experience, the Duncan Trussell Family Hour, and many other podcasts. Even before co-authoring the New York Times bestseller Sex at Dawn with Cacilda Jethá, MD, in 2010, Chris was on a wild ride. After receiving a BA in English and American Literature in 1984, he spent the next 2 decades traveling around the world, pausing in unexpected places to work at very odd jobs. In his mid-30s, Chris decided to get a little serious and pursued doctoral studies in psychology, using his dissertation to examine Darwin's rather naive understanding of human sexual evolution, providing the core arguments later advanced in Sex at Dawn. Chris's latest book, Civilized to Death, The Price of Progress, asks whether civilization has been a net benefit to our species. He hosts a weekly podcast, Tangentially Speaking, often recorded from the road while traveling in his van. The podcast features conversations with comics, bank robbers, drug smugglers, porn stars, authors, and an occasional rattlesnake expert. Chris Ryan, welcome to the show.
Welcome to Simply Walk the Talk. Our bodies and minds adapt to what we do most of the time. If you want to change your body and mind, you must change what it is you do most of the time. This podcast explores all things health, wellness, fitness, lifestyle, and biohacking. Stay tuned as we explore various thoughts, methods, and experiences from a multitude of conversations between our interesting guests and experts through many fields of work. Sit back, relax, and enjoy the show.
Simply walk the talk. Simply walk the talk.
Thank you. Great to be here, Josh.
Yeah. So I must say, first and foremost, shout out to my friend, Dr. Shaker Pie, for introducing us. And when he first mentioned that, we might be able to get you onto the show, I was really excited because your book, Sex at Dawn, really has been like pivotal in my life, in my career. It was something that sparked lots of thought and lots of questions and comments around why we stray, why we mate, why we as humans do what we do. And so I was just beyond thrilled to be able to speak with you. And then I've recently gotten your new book, Civilized to Death, and I've started reading it. I haven't finished it yet, but I look forward to talking about that as well. So I would love to just kind of talk about your background and maybe explain to the audience who you are and how you got to where you are today.
Well, I'm 61, so that could take the whole hour, if I did a minute per year. I guess I have an unusual background for someone who's talking about books and research and all that, because for most of my life, I wasn't doing this. I was traveling and adventuring and just kind of hanging out. What happened was I was in college and studying literature, as you mentioned, in upstate New York. And I kind of figured out a loophole in the rules that meant that I could skip my junior year, but still graduate on time. And I thought, well, that's cool. And I went to my parents who were paying for my college. And I said, look, what if I skip next year, and would you guys give me a little money, cause I'm going to save you a lot of money. And they were like, okay, we'll give you what we would pay for your room and board. Right. And the tuition we keep. Right. So I took that. So that was a few $1,000. And, I thought, okay, I'm going to go to Alaska, and I want to see a frontier. I had this idea, there are almost no frontiers left, right? And so Alaska is a frontier. So this was 1983. I hitchhiked from upstate New York to Seattle. And from Seattle, I got on this ferry up the Inside Passage, and then I hitchhiked from Skagway. Was it Skagway or Haines? I forget. I did it twice. Up through the Yukon, over to Fairbanks, and then down to Kenai. And I got a job in a cannery, gutting fish for a few weeks, salmon, and basically made, how much was it? $9,000 or something. I was living in a tent. I was working 16 hours a day. Anyway, I did that. And that was this crazy adventure where all kinds of things happened that really changed my vision of what I wanted my life to be. Because at the time I did this, I was like full bore academic. I was going to get a PhD, and I had a friend who was a professor at Oxford, and he was like going to hook me up at Oxford, and I was going to, teach literature and, be tenured at Princeton by the time I was 30. Like that was the dream I had. And I went on this crazy adventure to Alaska and I met all these people who were just fantastic people, really smart, really competent. Like, I remember this one guy picked me up. He took me to his house. I met his wife and his kids, and he had these dogs, and they gave me dinner and let me sleep in the, living room. And I was looking around and it was like, this guy doesn't know who Nietzsche is. And I've got like about half the weight in my backpack was my collected poetry of D.H. Lawrence and, all this essays and all this stuff that was so central to my identity, all this sort of intellectual stuff. And here's this guy, doesn't know any of this stuff, doesn't give a shit, but he built his house. He knows how to fix his car. He's got this awesome wife who clearly loves and respects him. His kids are cool. Like, his dogs are cool. Like, everything in his life works, and he's happy, but he's not an intellectual. And I look back at my friends at the university who were intellectuals, and they were miserable, and they didn't know how to do anything. And they were totally helpless in the world, but they were super smart, and they had their PhD from Yale, and, their friend taught at Harvard and all this kind of stuff. And I looked at my life and I said, I'm going down the wrong road here. Like this, I love literature. I still love literature. I love to read. I love to write. But I want to live. I don't want to read about living, So anyway, that trip, I was like 19 years old, something, maybe 20. And that was it. That was like, okay, I want to spend the next 10 years of my life until I'm 30 living, just traveling and seeing what I can see. And then when I'm 30, I'll figure out what I'm going to do in this life. So I remember I was sitting on the bluff in Kenai and I said, okay, until I'm 30, I'm not going to get married. I'm not going to have a career. I'm not going to go to graduate school or medical school or anything else. I'm not going to make any commitment to anything because I don't know what the fuck I'm doing. So I'm going to spend 10 years figuring out what this world is, and then I'll decide. So that's been my life plan, and that's kind of how it worked out.
Wow. It's amazing because we have a lot of similarities in that I think curiosity drives us, right? Like being curious about what is life, and I think that was one of the things. I was on this sort of curious path similar to yours, and I stumbled upon your book, Sex at Dawn. And, it's like when I go to Amazon or whatever, I read some of the things about it. It says it's a controversial, idea-driven book that challenges everything you think you know about sex, monogamy, marriage, and family. And that hooked me right away because I always knew, I grew up in Oklahoma, so I'm an Okie. And I grew up in a very, very small town. And my father was the chief of police. And, we had this very normal family. And then at one point, my mom and dad separated. And so then we went down another normal path, right? And I think most people today either have experienced divorce or they know someone who's been divorced. And so but it was interesting because my parents still got along. It wasn't that they didn't get along. It was just that they weren't compatible, right? For whatever reason. I'm sure there's a multitude of reasons. And I started to understand that more as I got older. And then I found myself kind of trying to figure out my own relationship status as well. Like, does it feel right to always, want to do what everyone else says, which is, graduate high school, go to college, get married, have kids, work one job, do that until you die, and then wash, rinse, and repeat. And it just never felt right for me. So when I stumbled upon your book, I was like, there's someone out there that's at least questioning the status quo. So I would like to know how you came about writing that, and then what are some of the key moments to finally putting pen to paper?
Well, as you mentioned in the intro, the book is based on my doctoral dissertation that I did at Saybrook. And the way that happened, I was actually working on something totally different. Like, couldn't be more different. It was about how oncologists and intensive care doctors deal with the fact that many, if not most of their patients die. And so what kind of personality profile of a doctor allows them to deal with that kind of existential stress without burning out? So I was a good year and a half into the research, interviewing doctors and going down that road, when I read a book called The Moral Animal by Robert Wright, which I was in a bookstore and I saw it on the shelf and picked it up and was like, oh, this looks interesting. It was explaining the new at the time science of evolutionary psychology, which is, taking the sort of Darwinian evolutionary understanding of how the body evolved, right? Like there are all these evolutionary arguments for why our nose protrudes from our face, not like a chimp's where the nostrils are just, like holes in the face, or why our ears are shaped this way, or our shoulders, or, our lung capacity. All these anatomical things are explained through evolution, but in evolutionary psychology, they're saying, well, we can take these same principles and explain behavioral and cognitive traits. So it tends to focus very much on sexuality and reproductive behavior. And so a lot of it's about why men and women evolved with different reproductive agendas and how that has shaped our behavior, and why there's this battle of the sexes that's interminable because we just have these different reproductive agendas. Anyway, I read that book and it's really well written. Wright is really great writer and thinker. And I love the book. And as I tend to do when I get excited about some idea, I tell everybody, right? And this is way before the days of podcasts. This is like the early 90s, I think. And so I'm telling everybody about it. And at the time, I happened to have a lot of friends in San Francisco who were sort of outspoken, feminist, many of them lesbian sex workers. Like a lot of strippers in San Francisco are actually gay. And anyway, so I was telling them this thing about, okay, well, women have sex because they're looking for someone to provide for their children, and men want to have sex with as many different women as they possibly can because they have a very low minimal parental investment, and the woman's parental investment is high, so she's more choosy. And I was like spouting all the stuff that I'd read in this book, and a lot of these women came back at me and they're like, dude, like that is such bullshit. That's not actually how women think or feel, or that's not what we're motivated by. And they made some good arguments. And so I thought, well, all right, let me look into this a little more. So I went and tracked down some of the original research. I was in grad school, so I had access to, libraries and research tools and all that. So I tracked down a lot of this original research, and I started to see things. I started to see how this Darwinian argument was more of a morality story that was, dressed up in scientific packaging. But it wasn't really following the science very closely. So, for example, there's a lot of talk about how humans have the same traits as chimpanzees in terms of violence and, infanticide and organized warfare and all the primate origins of all these things. But at that point, I had never heard of bonobos. Bonobos weren't being discussed in the public realm at all. Primatologists knew about them, but the public, they weren't spoken about because they were embarrassing, because they're hypersexual and they sort of undermine all these Hobbesian notions of human nature. And the fact is that humans are equally related to bonobos and chimps. So here's all this stuff about chimpanzees and humans, similarities to chimpanzees, but there was no discussion of bonobos. So as soon as I started reading about bonobos, immediately my curiosity was piqued. And also I was pissed off because I had just read this book that makes all these arguments and totally leaves out the counter argument, right? Yeah. It's like, oh yeah, humans are violent. Humans, males dominate females, and you have to be careful of other males because they'll murder the babies, and all this rape is a natural part of being a primate. Sorry about the bad news, but that's just the way it is, folks. I remember reading a book, Randy Thornhill. It was something about, the evolution of rape as being like a normal kind of evolutionary influence on human behavior. Anyway, they left out the bonobos. And I'm like, how can you leave out half the argument and present this as science? You're leaving out half the evidence, right? Yeah. Yeah. So that really pissed me off. And that sort of motivated me to dig into this deeper and deeper. And I got into anthropology, and it's like, wait a minute, there are all these hunter-gatherers who don't even know that sex causes babies, right? Why would they? Like, people are fucking, people get pregnant. Why would you connect the two, right? It didn't really make sense. And I'm reading all these accounts from missionaries and anthropologists and, first contact explorers about how relaxed these people, hunter-gatherers and North American Indians and people all over the world, how relaxed they are about sexuality, how there's no sense of sin. There's no sense of ownership, that the men own the women and possess, and, you can't have sex with her because she's mine. And it's totally foreign to these societies. And, at this point, I was in my mid-30s, so I had that long period that we talked about earlier where I traveled around the world and, lived in lots of different societies. And I had seen firsthand that, like, the range of possibility of human behavior and thinking was much wider than most of us think, right? Most of us just take what we consider to be normal and we project it out and assume everyone is more or less the same. And in some ways we are. We're all human. We all have human desires and fears and all that. But when it comes to something like sexuality, the range of possibility is much larger than most of us think. So anyway, I felt like I was pulling a thread on a tapestry, and the whole tapestry just started coming apart. And that was really exciting intellectually, because I thought, this cancer work that I was doing with the oncologists and was, I thought, really important, but it was depressing as hell. And it wasn't, I don't think I had the right personality for that. But this sexuality had always fascinated me, and the opportunity to look at this universal human concern from so many different perspectives, anthropological, primatological, anatomical, and also the sorts of issues that confront contemporary people who are, why do people go to marriage and family or relationship counseling, right? What are the things that bring them in there over and over and over again? So this was like, okay, this is a really exciting possibility for a dissertation. And so that's what I did. And then while I was writing this dissertation, and because of my background, I'm more of a writer than I am a scientist, for sure. My undergrad is in literature, and I've always written. And so I would try to be creative and funny and play, little word games or whatever. And every time my dissertation committee would cross it out, and in the margin, they wrote, "Save it for the book," right? Which at the time kind of pissed me off. It's like, come on, man, I'm trying to make your life better here, right? I'm trying to make this entertaining for you to read. And you're just, telling me, no, keep it boring. But then later, after I finished, I thought, it kind of could be a book. Like, this could be useful information if I could get it out there. But it wasn't until years later that I actually got around to sitting down and trying to write something.
Very fascinating. And I'm smiling because I have so many thoughts and questions that I could bring up in this moment. But one of the things I would like to at least present to you is when I started reading your book, I think I read it very quickly because I was just so enamored by the content in there, and then all these thoughts that I had. And I think I was even in a relationship at the time. And then subsequently I was not in a relationship. Right. And I have to put quotes around relationship, because what are relationships, right? Like there's so many different types of relationships in the world. And I found myself talking about the book more and more and more. And what I saw that it would do for me, at least in my orbit, the people that are around me, is it was opening up conversation. And that's what I'm all about. That's the reason why I have a podcast. That's the reason why I like to do what I do, is to open up the platform for good conversations, compelling conversations about things, and not being attached to any sort of shame or ego. And when I bring up the word shame, I think this is one of the things that I see the most when I do talk about these situations with people. It's like we're attached to so much shame that, like, innately we probably do feel everything you talk about in the book, everything we're going to talk about today. People probably do attach to it and feel that, and they agree with it. But then because we're supposed to not be a certain way, then people, they shoot it down. And I'm sure you know Brene Brown, right? She's the author.
Yeah.
And one of the books that I really enjoyed reading is The Gifts of Imperfection. And what's cool about that is because the subtitle is "Let Go of Who You Think You're Supposed to Be and Embrace Who You Are." And I feel like that paired with Sex at Dawn is such a good moment, right? Because if we can really truthfully, because, and I'm sorry, I'm going on a tangent here, but I just want to get these thoughts out. When I think about the things that we worry about the most, if you really understand that it's such a fraction, it's like a grain of sand compared to this universe. And we worry about so much when really it's nothing, right? So we should be here to explore what this world is about. We should be here to explore sexuality, sensuality. We should be exploring, relationships with our family, with our friends, with our loved ones. So I guess my question to you is, and I know you've dealt with loads of criticism, but what did you take from getting this book written and putting it out there? Like, what did you take from that? Did you experience your own turmoil, or was it all happy-go-lucky for you? What is your journey in all this?
Oh man, it's such a crazy journey, right? Because I did the PhD, and I was teaching English in Barcelona to doctors and living hand to mouth. And I met this woman, Cacilda, who you mentioned earlier, who's a psychiatrist from Mozambique. She was living in Portugal, and we got together, and it was the first time I had ever had any money, really. Like I was always just, work, buy, work, buy, work, buy. And my whole life was about traveling and adventure and stuff, as I said earlier. So anytime I'd save up a little money, I'd hit the road, and make it last as long as I could. And anyway, I met her, and it was the first time, I was in a relationship with a woman who had a job, like she's a doctor and she's like a serious person. And of course, the first thing we did was I convinced her to quit her job, and we went and traveled in Asia for a year and a half because she had never done that before. Like she had just been, a single mom and medical school and working, and, and she had done heroic stuff. She worked in a war zone in Africa, and, she was like super inspiring. But then we sort of settled down in Barcelona, and she was running this mental, psychiatric hospital. And she was like, you got to write this book, man. Like this is serious. This is a really good idea, and you really know it, and you should write this book. So she really encouraged me to do it. And she also provided me the financial security so I could stay at home and write. And she not intentionally, but the fact that we would get up together, have breakfast, and then she would go run a mental hospital. I'm a lazy bastard, man. But even I couldn't go back to bed knowing she was off working her ass off all day long, expecting me to write a book, right? So I actually had to sit down and work on it. And then she would come home from work. Now, keep in mind, she grew up speaking Portuguese, right? In Mozambique. And when we got together, she spoke English very well. And so we spoke in English all the time. Then she decided she was going to come and live with me in Barcelona. She learned Spanish and Catalan, two languages in 3 months. Now she's working in a hospital as the director of this hospital in 2 languages she just learned a few months ago.
Wow. And
And then she comes home from work, sits down, and reads what I've written that day in English and gives me feedback on, oh, you might want to look into this, or, in Africa, that's not the way people think. And, this seems more culturally nuanced this way or that way. Fantastic. So she really kind of motivated me in many different ways to get serious about writing this book. I didn't know anybody in publishing. I didn't have an agent. I was like totally isolated from that world. So I thought there was a very small chance this would ever get published at all. And I don't know, I don't want to take up all our time talking about that journey, but it's been incredible because basically what happened was I sent out some query emails to some agents in New York, to 20. I sent them out on a Thursday night, I remember, and I was like, they're all going to say no. But maybe 1 or 2 of them will say, I think you should, contact so-and-so. He might be interested, or maybe you need to think about shaping it more this way or that way. I sent out these emails, and by Monday morning, 18 of the 20 were offering to represent me. And some of them were even like, we'll fly you to New York. We want to meet you. We want to introduce you to so-and-so. Like it was, in one weekend, it went from no one is ever going to even answer me to 18 agencies want to work with me. Like, holy shit, this is crazy. So yeah, that began a strange chapter in my life that continues. It's calmed down a lot, but I went from teaching English in Barcelona for 20 euros an hour to giving TED Talks and, having my stuff in the New York Times and CNN and, like being on Netflix and everywhere. HBO, all these producers want to do a TV series, and I'm going to be the Anthony Bourdain of sex. And there's like all this crazy stuff happening. But what was really, I think, unique about it is that I was like 40 when this happened. So it wasn't like something that was going to shape my personality, right? Like I was already who I was. And then suddenly, publishers are throwing money at me, and I'm getting represented by United Talent Agency in LA, and I'm going to meetings in these crazy Hollywood studio offices, but for me, it was like all a big accident. It was just ridiculous, like meeting these famous people and going to these parties. And I was just like, I'm not supposed to be here, right? Like I never really wanted to be famous. I didn't try to be famous. This just fell out of the sky. And so here I am. But it's all kind of silly and ridiculous,
Well, I think it goes to show just how important the content and the context of what you wrote. I think it goes to show just how important that is, because obviously, there's people that probably are reading this book in the dark, alone by themselves, maybe ashamed to be on the subway reading it. Right?
Yeah.
But at the end of the day, like, I think that's what we should be doing. We should be putting this out there. We should be challenging some of the thought processes that are out there. And I must say, like, kudos to Cacilda, because I think if that had been a different person, someone that maybe is a little bit resentful for the fact that she was supporting you and working and you're at home doing quote unquote nothing, I think it would have been a very different book, right? And so
there would have been no book.
Right. Yeah. Shout out to
yeah.
that. So I do have a question. Speaking of you being a lazy bastard, when there are moments in which you've been maybe sat still or lying down for long periods of time, is there anything that you do to sort of get you out of that? Maybe it's to spur a new thought or a new piece of content. Is there anything that you do to get out of those moments of sedentary lifestyle?
I like to walk a lot, and I lived in Spain for 20 years. And one of the things I loved about living in Barcelona is that I would walk miles every day without even thinking about it, just because it's so nice to walk there. The way the city's designed, there are no dead zones. Everywhere you go, there are cafes and shops and life in the street. And just the Spanish approach to life is really healthy and wise and sensual, which is why I lived there. When I first got to Spain, I remember just feeling like, man, I get this place. Like I really understand this way of living. This makes sense to me. And the US never made sense to me as a culture. So yeah, I love to walk. Where I live now, I'm in the middle of nowhere. So I'm in Colorado at 8,000 feet and, like wilderness. And so I go for walks every day, walk a few miles. But if it's just like to break up when I've been writing or something and I just sort of need to loosen up a little bit, I do this thing that I learned like when I was 8 years old. I studied Kung Fu, and one of the loosening up exercises we did, I don't know if I can show you because I got the headphones and the microphone and everything, but basically you stand up, you probably know this one.
We can see it. Oh, good.
All right, let me see. So basically you stand up and you put your arms up, and then they fall in opposite directions. So you sort of spin your arms in opposite directions like this.
Yes.
And then when you get tired, you switch and go the other way. And people find it really confusing. But what I like about it is that it's one of these things that the less you think about it, the easier it gets, you know? And I think there's something really valuable, especially for someone who works with their head a lot. There's something really valuable about an activity that requires you to disengage your brain a little bit and just let your body flow. And so with this, the whole key is just pivoting your shoulders and not thinking about what your arms are doing, right? And it just naturally flows that way. And so I do that. I try to do that. I'll go out on the deck and look out over this beautiful valley where we live and just sort of spin my shoulders a bit for a while.
I call that opposing arm circles. And I know it's a very popular drill or movement in the Feldenkrais method. And a lot of actors and theater actors, they tend to do that. And I use that as a piece of a warm-up session with my clients. So almost all of my clients have done that at some point. And very soon I'm going to be posting a windmill exercise that incorporates that while rotating left to right. So it goes into like a freestyle stroke into a backstroke. You do it left to right. So I'll be posting that very, very soon. But thanks for sharing that, because that is brilliant. And I do love the way that sort of repaves the neural networks in the brain. This is very important, no matter what task it is you're doing. When you can sort of clear out that pathway and the neural networks, then it opens you up to a lot more creativity. So I think that's a brilliant one you showed. Probably one of my favorites so far. So thanks for sharing that. I was thinking you were going to show an exercise with that hand weight that you have near you. Maybe we could talk about that. I think it's a good segue for the hand weight.
This thing?
If you're watching this episode, then you see that there's this amazing trophy called the AVN. Can you explain how you got that and why you have that?
Yeah, I'm very proud of it. It's my only trophy, and it's heavy. It's really heavy. So the AVN is considered like the Academy Award of porn. And what happened was I met this guy on a speaking tour when I was giving talks about sex at dawn. This guy organized this crazy, I tell you, I have the best like author experiences ever, right? The whole being the author of Sex at Dawn is not like being the author of anything else, I think. So this guy set up this thing in San Francisco, and it was like, okay, like I would give my Sex at Dawn talk, my PowerPoint with slides and talk about, monkey balls and all the stuff that I talk about. And then it would turn into like a dance party, and their DJs, and then at some point, like it changed like at 10 o'clock or midnight or whatever. And then it was like topless, and there were new dancers, and it just became this whole thing. And, so anyway, I met this guy who had set that whole thing up, and then we sort of became friends. And at one point he said to me, like, I'm thinking of doing this movie, of directing an erotic film that would be a serious look at ethical non-monogamy. So it would have sex in it. So it's a porn film, but it's a full-length feature film with character development and, quality filmmaking. And I got money from, I think Adam and Eve is the company. They make sex toys and stuff, and like they're funding it. And so, he ended up making this film. It's called Marriage 2.0. And the idea is, and it's starring famous porn stars, India Summer, and I forget who Nina Hartley's in it, who was in Boogie Nights, serious people in that world. Anyway, the idea of the film was that this couple is having difficulties in their relationship, and they decide that they want to stay together, but they want to open up their relationship and have sex with other people, but they want to do it consciously and honestly. And in the course of doing that, the woman, played by India Summer, is a documentary filmmaker. And so she decides she wants to make a documentary where she interviews people who have written books about sexuality. And I'm one of those people. So she interviews me in this kind of movie within the movie about sex at dawn and monogamy and human sexual evolution and all that. And then we have a scene, like she starts crying in the middle of our interview, and she sort of leaves the set. And then the next scene is I'm in the kitchen with her, and and we're talking, and she's saying, I'm sorry, it's just that I'm going through this thing and I don't know what to do. And so we're sort of having this heart-to-heart conversation in the kitchen. Anyway, so I play myself in this film, and then, he finishes the film and it comes out. And then I get this email one night. Someone's like, hey, dude, you're nominated for an AVN award. And I was like, what's an AVN award? Like, yeah, it's the Oscar of porn. And, you're, and I forget the list of the other nominees, but, they were all these fake names, like, Dick Pounder and,
Chocolate Thunder.
Exactly. and then it's like Dr. Christopher Ryan, PhD. And then they had the thing in Vegas, and I won, and they sent me this trophy in 2016. But my favorite thing about it is the category that I won for is best non-sex performance.
Yeah. There you go. Stimulating that mind. Stimulation.
You win a porn award for best non-sex performance. It's like I don't know. It's like a an athletic like most awkward athletic competition. Like the guy who doesn't get laid still wins an award. So
where I thought you were headed with that, I'm glad you pointed out the fact that it was best non-sex, in a porn. I thought when you were having that heart-to-heart conversation in the kitchen, it was going to go into the bow chicka bow bow.
Oh man, up against the fridge, baby.
Right. Yeah. Well, that's impressive. Honestly, I think it's really cool, and I'm happy that there's things like this out there because it makes all of this fun. I think when you mentioned Cacilda initially, you mentioned that she was a very serious person, and I feel like we obviously have to have a number of serious moments throughout our life, especially when you're doing the kind of work that she was doing. But I also think that we can have fun with the serious things that we do in life. We can have fun with relationships. We can have fun with our work. And when the common cliche, which is, if you love what you do, you'll never work a day in your life. However it goes, I'm sure I butchered it, but that's kind of how I live my life. I feel like we can have as much fun as we want. And of course we do have responsibilities and things like that, but we should have fun. This is what this life is here for, is to live it, to thrive. Right.
Yeah, man. There's the rest of it. And that's what I said. I really felt good living in Spain, because in Spain, everybody gets that. Everybody understands, like, we are here to enjoy ourselves. Yes, we have to work. We have to pay the rent. You have to do this. But, I would say most people in Spain, if you said, look, if you work, you could work 60 hours a week and have a 5-bedroom house and 3 cars, or you could work 30 hours a week and have a modest apartment and 1 small car. Which would you take? The Spanish people will always go for B, and Americans will almost always go for A. And to me, that's just a lack of wisdom. It's like, you think you're going to live forever? What are you going to do with that big house? What are you going to do with 5 cars? Just enjoy your life and have less. And I agree with you. So, I mean, that's sort of what Civilized to Death is about. And And the next book that I'm thinking about writing is very much about that kind of thing as well. Like, you know, life is not about accumulating more. It's not about impressing other people. It's not about all this external bullshit that everybody's running around worrying about. It's how many sunsets have you watched? How many people have you loved? How many people have loved you? How much time have you spent just looking at the stars? You know, how many streams have you drank from? You know, it's like, these are the luxuries that we should really be concerned with, because the others are all just bait and switch. It's all to make money for someone else. And I think once you disengage from that and understand, like, you know, I'm surrounded by lies. Every advertisement is a lie, you know, or many lies. Then you can sort of step back and say, okay, what really matters? What really makes people happy, healthy? What really is important in a relationship? And that's why that's the only thing that really motivates me to write, is trying to relieve unnecessary suffering. And I think people are suffering greatly, and most of it is totally unnecessary.
Yeah, what comes to mind for me is there's the idea of IQ, which is intelligence quotient, and then there's EQ, which is emotional quotient. But then I like to play around with the idea of life quotient. Like how much quality of life do you have? I think that's kind of what you're saying. At least that's how I perceive it. And it makes a lot of sense to me as well. And that's the reason why I wanted to dive into your book. Obviously, I knew I was going to have you on the show, so I wanted to explore a bit of your new book, Civilized to Death. I love the title. I love the subtitle. For those of you that are watching, we have that pulled up. It is Civilized to Death, The Price of Progress. And I feel like just the title and the subtitle alone should be enough to make you question, should I read this book? And I think the answer is yes. And obviously, I would love to, if we can keep in touch and maybe have you back on so we can dive into that more, because obviously we spent a lot of time today just, shooting the shit and talking about your first works. But I think before we wrap up, like, could you maybe kind of give a teaser or trailer into that book, maybe a little bit more than what you just discussed?
Yeah, I think the idea of Civilized to Death, the germ of it was in Sex at Dawn. So what happened was, in writing Sex at Dawn, I realized I can't just talk about sexuality as if it were separate from the rest of life, right? Because it isn't. You can't talk about sexuality without talking about family, without talking about power dynamics and even economics, and, all these things are interrelated. So in Sex at Dawn, I decided, just sort of in the middle, I would slip in a chapter, sort of looking at these sort of related issues. So economics, politics, family dynamics, how children are raised, diet, things like that, health, right? How old people are dealt with and all that. Because I'm talking so much about hunter-gatherer societies, I need to sort of flesh out the picture a little bit. But I thought it would be like, that people are going to be a little bored by this because they're reading this book because they're interested in the sexuality aspect. So it was kind of like, wrapping the pill up in the meat to give to the dog and kind of hope they won't notice it, but just it's good for them. But I was surprised when Sex at Dawn came out that a lot of people, commented like, hey, I really enjoyed the book. I wish there had been more about the family and the politics and the economics and stuff like that. That was really interesting. And you just sort of skimmed over it. So I thought, okay, the second book will be an expansion of that stuff, the aspects of hunter-gatherer life that we can apply to modern life and sort of look at modern life through the eyes of our ancestors. So that was the germ of the book. And then as I got into it, it became more of like a cost benefit analysis, right? Because one of the sort of most overwhelming propaganda points that we're all subjected to is this idea that civilization is just an incredible gift. And we should just be so fucking grateful for the gifts of civilization, for, the cures for diseases and the, how horrible everyone's life was until civilization. And then everything got so wonderful. And okay, there are still some issues and still some problems, but progress is undeniable. And, modern life is so great. And I had spent like a decade studying hunter-gatherers at this point, and I knew that this is a much more nuanced issue than we're being told. So I kind of wanted to present a more complete analysis of like, okay, in what areas is civilization actually a net positive, and in what areas have we been lied to? And it turns out that, man, the lies are everywhere. So, I mean, a very prominent example is almost everybody thinks our ancestors died at 35, right? So every time I'm at a fucking dinner party and I mention this book, the first thing I get is like, yeah, well, we've doubled the human lifespan. No, we haven't. No, we haven't. We are so much less healthy than our ancestors were 50,000 years ago. And our bodies are not designed for the life that we're living now. So, you hear all this stuff about, okay, so everyone died at 35. No, that's average age, life expectancy at birth. It's true that a lot of babies died, right? So mathematically, the average for every baby who's born, if half or 20% of them die before they're 10, that average works out quite low. But no human being has ever been old at 35, right? Hunter-gatherers routinely live into their 70s, even 80s. So this idea that everyone died at 35 is just nonsense. And, another aspect of it is, well, we've cured all these diseases. We have antibiotics and we have dentistry, if your tooth gets infected or whatever. Yes, but most of the diseases that we treat with those medications didn't exist for our ancestors. They didn't have tooth abscesses and wisdom teeth impacting other teeth. They didn't have all these issues. So it's almost like, it's like saying, well, thank God we have airbags. Yeah, but our ancestors weren't driving cars, so they didn't need airbags. It's a weird kind of argument. So anyway, that's what Civilized to Death is. It's kind of a global look at life, ranging from how children are raised to how illness is treated, to how old people are treated, to relationships between men and women, to politics, and how are leaders chosen, and how are economics, how are resources distributed, and then looking at how we've sort of gotten off track in many aspects of modern life, and how that manifests in illness and anxiety and depression and all sorts of other ways.
That's a very wonderful overview, and I think that certainly should get a few people listening to this to at least want to go out and check out the book. And it's interesting when you were explaining that, the thing that comes to my mind is when you have a hammer, everything looks like a nail, right? And I think that's part of that issue of course, yes, we have all these advances today, but that's because of all the stuff that we've done to our species in today's world. And so like you, even with my work, I try to do my best to blend ancestral wisdom in terms of health, wellness, fitness, lifestyle, and blend that together with modern technology to be able to try to go back and forth, because it's not one or the other. I think when we live in this world, when everything is black and white, it's bipartisan, it's always division. We talked about this on a previous podcast, but when we live that way, it is much easier to divide us. And I think we need to look at coming together more, having more of these long form conversations. This is the new mainstream. So I definitely appreciate you coming on and talking about that and doing the work that you do. And as we start to wrap up, I have 2 questions that I like to ask, which I sort of prepped you on. So we'll see how that goes. The first question is, what are your top 2 pet peeves? Or you can just give me one since we're short on time.
Well, I alluded to it earlier. I think my biggest pet peeve is unnecessary suffering. And I think shame is a very prominent manifestation of that. So, you know, a lot of the work that I've done has been trying to set the record straight about what kind of animal Homo sapiens is and what we can realistically expect given our biological and evolutionary past. And so I think a lot of the things that people feel ashamed about are things that sort of authority figures or institutions have told us are unnatural and wrong and sinful. And once you get that hook in you, it's really hard to get it out. But it's an excellent way to control people. Tell them that their natural appetites and yearnings and desires are sinful, and then they'll always have a secret that they're trying to hide, and you know what that secret is, so you can blackmail them into doing whatever you want. That's basically the history of Western religion and a lot of medical institutions and so on. So that's what I'm trying to do. I consider it quite subversive, because what I'm saying to people is, you know, for example, in the case of a relationship, you're in a long-term monogamous relationship with someone and the passion starts to fade, and you think it's because there's something wrong with your relationship, or there's something wrong with you, or there's something wrong with your partner. And I'm calling bullshit on all that. That doesn't mean there's anything wrong with anything there. All it means is that's not how our species evolved to live in terms of sexuality. So you're going to have effects. You're going to have issues come up, but it's not your fault and it's not her fault. It's just you're in an unnatural situation, which doesn't mean it's wrong. We choose unnatural situations all the time, right? Like I often say, monogamy is like vegetarianism. You can choose it. It can be a great idea. It can be really healthy. It can be ethically fantastic, but it's not going to be easy because we are not herbivores. We're omnivores. So just because you've decided to be a vegetarian doesn't mean bacon suddenly stops smelling good, right? It's still going to smell good. Don't blame yourself for that. Don't beat yourself up. That's unavoidable.
Beautifully put. Thank you for that, because I couldn't agree more. Last question. What is something you are most grateful for?
I'm grateful. There's a poem called The Grandeur of God by Gerard Manley Hopkins that I read when I was a teenager, and I think about it quite often. And basically he says the way he was Catholic, I'm not, but I still think there's some supernatural benevolent energy in our lives, because things are so much more beautiful than they have to be. And that's basically what he's saying in the poem. He's like, you know, I remember there's the phrase he says, even the necessary embrace of love as beautiful as fire, or something like that. In other words, he's saying like, okay, well, we're a sexually reproducing species, so it makes sense that it feels good, but it doesn't have to feel that good. You know, lots of animals exist without love, as far as we know, right? There's all this extra, you know, the sunsets don't need to be that fucking awesome night after night after night. You know, the stars don't need to be that amazing. So I just feel like he says, is it not by his grand superfluousness that we know our God? I just feel like things are much better than they need to be for the necessities of biology, right? So I try to focus on that. I try to really appreciate how good it feels to eat good food, and how just to smell good food, to feel hungry and then to feel not hungry, and to take a hot bath, and like these simple pleasures in life. I feel like that's what keeps it real. And I think I've learned a wisdom in just focusing on the simple, small, daily pleasures and not worry about grand ambitions.
Beautiful. Thank you for sharing that. I've had a fabulous time chatting with you, and I hope that we can continue chatting and hopefully even bring you back on to talk more in depth about Civilized to Death and your newest adventure and a book that you're working on. If you could you let people know the best place to keep in touch with your work, keep in touch with you? If you could just let people know.
Yeah, the best place is my Substack, and that's just chrisryan.substack.com. The podcast is there, occasional writing and monthly newsletters and, all that kind of stuff. And I do book club and I do a lot of stuff, and it all goes through Substack. So that's the best place.
Beautiful. Well, as always, we will list all of the necessary information in the show notes. And if you guys have any questions, comments, or you want us to discuss something more in depth with Christopher Ryan, then please let us know. And thank you for your time, Chris. I mean, this has been a huge honor for me. And hopefully we chat again soon. Yeah?
Yeah, I hope so. I had fun. Thank you.
All right. This is Josh signing off from Simply Walk the Talk. Until next time, peace.
Simply walk the talk. Walk the talk, talking facts. Move like me, but I move a little fast. Make my move, here to last. Fasten these seat belts, I'm coming past. Take care of me, longevity. Hack my biology, better believe. Walking the talk, soul, mind, and body connected. Better come give us a listen.